Good evening, Ross.
Good evening.
So the Company Act was revised recently, of course, on July the 7th, in fact, and the government have said that it's a critical factor in sort of clamping down on money laundering and making sure that Taiwan passes the upcoming review.
Well, Taiwan has been the target of criticism in the international financial regulatory community for a number of years over deficiencies in anti-money laundering. There's two aspects to look at this, Gavin. One is, are the laws and regulations strong enough? Are they robust? Are they clear? Can they be implemented? The second aspect is the culture of compliance. Now, I would argue that for many years, Taiwan has actually had good laws and regulations on the books. The problem is the culture of compliance, or the lack thereof. It's a willingness of staff to ask questions about transactions, to identify suspicious transactions, and to escalate it internally within an organization. Now, that last aspect is the problem that many Taiwan financial institutions have repeatedly had with very large transactions that eventually get into the news, result in regulatory action both in Taiwan or overseas. And we have to keep in mind that Taiwan organizations, including business organizations, tend to be very top-down, and junior people sometimes are very reluctant to identify to their supervisors that they see something suspicious. And we have seen situations in Taiwan where questionable transactions that might involve money laundering or other types of corporate misdeeds are not escalated for further review because it's clear that the other side of the transaction is either a connected person to the financial institution in question, or they're a favored client, they're close to the group that controls the financial institution, whatever it is. So we see that the culture is sometimes the problem. So it doesn't matter how great the laws and regulations are. And in fact, Taiwan was one of the first countries in Asia to actually have a written anti-money laundering law, a dedicated law, as opposed to separate regulations on the issue. Taiwan passed a dedicated anti-money laundering law in the 1990s, far ahead of other Asian jurisdictions. But then it's the culture of compliance, or the lack thereof, that is repeatedly the problem in Taiwan.
But I mean, who is it that's money laundering here? I mean, is it criminals from the Middle East, South America, or is it local people that are basically just hiding their money?
That's a very good question, and the most recent report that was issued by the Executive UN's Anti-Money Laundering Office in May of this year identified around 8 examples, broadly speaking, not specific cases, of the type of money laundering that we see here in Taiwan. And some of that is as a result of criminal activities such as drug trafficking, telecommunications fraud. So the things that we as a public might easily understand are the proceeds of criminal activity. And then the other types of anti-money laundering might be tax evasion-related, things like that. However, the key thing is, and to answer your question, most of the anti-money laundering activity we see here in Taiwan is as a result of the activities of locally based Taiwanese individuals or Taiwanese companies. It's very rare that foreign parties would use Taipei as a location to launder money. Now, sometimes the money laundering that occurs in Taiwan by Taiwanese individuals or organizations is as a result of criminal activity that takes place outside Taiwan. So, for example, selling narcotics to Philippines, North Korea, Australia, and trying to launder the proceeds here because the people come from here, and it's a place they're very familiar with as a location to launder the money. So there is a cross-border aspect sometimes to the money laundering activity, but it's pretty rare to see terrorists from other places or narcotics trafficking organizations from other places coming to Taiwan and bringing their cash from outside Taiwan into Taiwan for purposes of that. That being said, for public relations purposes, when the government in Taiwan talks about its AML, anti-money laundering efforts, very often you will hear the words anti-terrorism financing, and we're doing a lot on anti-terrorism financing. That's mostly a public relations exercise, because the key part, or the most of the and the money laundering activity that takes place here in Taiwan is as a result of illicit activities by Taiwanese individuals or Taiwanese organizations.
Right, obviously the group is coming at the end of this year, and if they go away saying that Taiwan hasn't done enough to stop money laundering or to enact proper anti-money laundering mechanisms, how do you think this could affect Taiwan's banking internationally?
Well, the result would probably be that Taiwan would pass more regulations and potentially more laws, probably issue more fines, as the regulator has been doing over the course of this year, and engage in other corrective activities to satisfy the requirements of the Asia-Pacific Anti-Money Laundering Organization. That really would be the first step. It wouldn't change how international businesses, for example, view Taiwan. Companies that already have operations here are not going to reduce the scope of their operations simply because Taiwan gets a bad grade in the money laundering review. What might happen, actually, though, is it does increase the cost of doing business here because if, for example, we're in Hong Kong or Singapore or London and New York and we're transacting with a financial institution in Taiwan or a corporate in Taiwan, and we see that the international organizations have given Taiwan bad grades, then we as a counterparty might have to do additional work, and we may be required to do that by our own internal regulations or the local regulations by a government in those locations. So there are compelling reasons for Taiwan to satisfy the requirements of this review, and if there are any shortcomings that are identified, then Taiwan has a lot of motivation to address those shortcomings, but ultimately it will increase the cost of doing business.
Well, I mean, could it stymie local banks' plans to move into foreign markets? Because, of course, we have the new southbound policy, and lots of banks here are looking to move into Southeast Asian countries.
Well, it sometimes does come up when a regulator in another location, again, as I mentioned in the early example, which was transaction-based, a regulator will also look at who are you? Who is this financial institution that is coming into my country and wants to either expand by organic growth, building its own organization, or by acquiring an existing organization? And yes, certainly the regulators in those countries will look at the grades that Taiwan as a jurisdiction has received from these kinds of ratings organizations. So again, that's one more compelling reason why Taiwan will want to satisfy the requirements. It raises another interesting question, which is sometimes when international rating organizations, whether it's for business environment or corruption, give Taiwan a bad grade, we sometimes see a negative reaction here, right? The reaction might be, oh, well, you didn't talk to enough people, you didn't understand our efforts, you didn't really take the time to understand our laws and regulations. So sometimes there's this kind of pushback from Taiwan when it receives a negative ranking by an international organization. But this one is so sensitive and it impacts so many business activities that, again, it's really important for Taiwan to comply with the requests that the organization makes for any corrective measures. But let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's hope that Taiwan does pass the review, given the actions that have occurred over the last few years, such as revising the money laundering law, revising the company law, additional training for bank staff that has taken place over the last few years. Many financial institution employees here in Taiwan have actually taken exams to receive international certification in identifying transactions that are suspicious. So all of these things taken together hopefully will lead Taiwan to pass this year's review.
And there'll be no embarrassments like the mega bank embarrassment in New York?
Well, here's the thing, Gavin, and this goes back to the issue of a culture of compliance. Given the repeated times that these incidents have occurred, when I say repeated, I mean not just the very specific money laundering, but the other examples that I cited where there's a suspicious transaction involving maybe a connected party that does not get identified for further review. So money gets lent, and it's clear that it shouldn't have been because the borrower really didn't have the ability to repay, but it was someone close to the people who control the bank, and the money gets lent. You know, we've seen so many situations of bad behavior by financial institutions here in Taiwan. So to answer your question, Gavin, no matter what marks and grades that Taiwan gets in this year's review, what other efforts have been made to change the laws and regulations, train staff, I guarantee you, within the next few years, you and I will be having a conversation on Taiwan this week about some kind of situation at a financial institution where money shouldn't have been lent or some other kind of bad behavior, and it's just inevitable because it's a compliance culture issue that will take a long time to fix.